My Lords and members of the House of Commons, it is mindful of a legacy of service and devotion to this country's set.
King Charles's lawyers just basically confirmed that Birkhall and the Greville tiara, the pieces Camilla quietly wanted secured for good, are instead being pulled toward his sister, Princess Anne. And the way it's unfolding is honestly more calculated than anyone expected.
Let's bring you some breaking news that has come to us in the last minute or so from Buckingham Palace. His Majesty the King has today initiated a formal process.
The part that really gets us is that Camilla reportedly pushed, thinking they belonged to her all this while.
In an interview with the BBC, the Queen says the incident left her feeling angry, as she described how the experience haunted her for several years.
And the family isn't rushing to settle it in her favor, with Anne's concerns now sitting right at the center of it all. That's not a small family disagreement. That's a legacy decision. Before we get into it, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Why Birkhall became the center of it all. Okay, so, like you just heard, the property at the heart of this new controversy is Birkhall, a private country house on the Balmoral estate in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. According to widespread reports, lawyers acting on behalf of King Charles have quietly confirmed new arrangements for the future of Birkhall, and the details have left Queen Camilla reportedly stunned.
There's been a strategic shift within the royal family.
But to understand why this house matters so much and why its future has become such a sensitive subject, it helps to look at where it came from in the first place. So keep watching till the end to get the full gist. Birkhall has a history that stretches back long before Charles or Camilla ever set foot inside it. The house was originally built in the 18th century and became part of the wider Balmoral estate after Prince Albert purchased the surrounding land for Queen Victoria in 1852. Unlike the main castle, Birkhall has always had a smaller, more intimate character, tucked away along the River Muick rather than sitting at the center of the estate's grandeur. For much of the 20th century, Birkhall was closely associated with one royal in particular, and that person was the Queen Mother. You see, she lived there for decades, and it became one of her most cherished homes, a quiet retreat away from the more formal surroundings of Balmoral Castle itself. Friends and biographers often described it as the place where she felt most like herself, surrounded by tartan furnishings, her own art collection, and gardens she had personally shaped over the years. When the Queen Mother passed away in 2002,
the Queen Mother has died peacefully at the age of 101. The announcement from Buckingham Palace said the Queen was at her bedside. The Prime Minister's tribute, she symbolised Britain's decency and courage.
Birkhall did not remain with the Crown Estate or pass automatically to the reigning monarch. Instead, because it had always been her private property, she was free to leave it to whomever she chose. She left it to her grandson, the then Prince Charles, rather than to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth, who already had Balmoral itself. That decision was widely seen at the time as a reflection of how close Charles and his grandmother had always been. That distinction matters a lot to this story, because unlike Sandringham or Balmoral itself, which passed through the monarch's private estate by long tradition, Birkhall came to Charles as a personal inheritance from his grandmother, entirely separate from any institutional royal property. From a legal standpoint, that meant Charles could do whatever he wished with it, sell it, rent it out, or leave it to anyone he chose in his own will, without needing permission from the Crown Estate or any government body. He chose to keep it, and over the years Birkhall reportedly became one of his and Camilla's favorite private residences, even more so, according to some royal commentators, than Highgrove or Sandringham. Camilla has often been described by those close to the family as feeling more at home at Birkhall than almost anywhere else, in part because it still carries so much of the Queen Mother's personal touch, from the furnishings to the gardens she once tended herself. Reports over the years have suggested that Charles and Camilla spent considerable time at Birkhall together long before their marriage, often retreating there during quieter periods away from the public eye. After their wedding in 2005, The house reportedly took on even greater sentimental value for Camilla, partly because it offered a level of privacy that busier royal residences simply could not provide, and partly because she had come to associate it with some of the calmest years of her relationship with Charles. Some royal commentators have gone as far as suggesting that, of all the properties connected to the family, Birk Hall was the one Camilla had quietly hoped would one day be secured for her own future use, regardless of whatever else might change within the family. But that was not the only property Camilla wanted badly. Alongside the house itself, another private inheritance from the Queen Mother has reportedly become part of this unfolding story, is the Greville tiara. Unlike the crown jewels or the wider royal collection, this particular piece never belonged to the institution of the monarchy at all. It originally belonged to Dame Margaret Greville, a wealthy, society hostess and close friend of the royal family, who left more than 60 pieces of jewelry to the Queen Mother personally when she died in 1942. The Greville tiara, crafted by the French jeweler Boucheron, became one of the Queen Mother's most treasured and most frequently worn pieces for the rest of her life. When the Queen Mother passed away in 2002, the Greville tiara did not go to Charles, unlike Birk Hall. Instead, it passed to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, in the Odorn d'Or does not go to Charles, unlike Birk Hall. Same way any private item might pass from mother to child. Reports suggest the late Queen never wore the tiara herself, perhaps because it remained too closely associated with her own mother. Around 2006, the Queen decided to lend the Greville tiara to Camilla, and it has since become one of her most recognizable tiaras, appearing at state banquets and the state opening of Parliament. Over the years, the tiara became so closely associated with Camilla that many assumed it had effectively become hers. But that assumption may not reflect the legal reality. According to reports, Camilla has only ever held the Greville tiara on loan, first from Queen Elizabeth II and, since 2022, understood to continue under King Charles. It was never formally gifted to her outright, meaning ownership technically still rests with whoever controls the late Queen Mother's line of private inheritance. Because the tiara was always personal property rather than a crown asset, it can legally be passed down, loaned, or reassigned entirely at the discretion of its owner, without needing approval from Parliament, the Crown Estate, or any institutional body. That freedom is reportedly what has made the current situation so sensitive. If Charles had simply chosen to formally gift the tiara to Camilla outright, it would have been a private matter, similar to any family member deciding to give away an heirloom permanently instead of merely lending it. But reports suggest that is not what has happened. Instead, sources close to the family have suggested a different name has entered the conversation. Princess Anne, the king's sister and one of the most trusted figures within the family, is believed to have been quietly involved in discussions about the tiara's future alongside the question of what becomes of Birk Hall. For a family so often associated with grand palaces and formal crown estate rules, the idea that a private country house and a single heirloom tiara could become the center of such a significant shift has taken many royal watchers by surprise. But those who understand how deeply Anne's own history is tied to the Queen Mother, and how seriously she takes questions of family legacy, may find it less surprising than it first appears. So why would Princess Anne suddenly become central to a decision many assumed had already been informally settled in Camilla's favor? And what does her long relationship with the Queen Mother have to do with any of this? Now, don't go anywhere, because Anne's relationship with the Queen Mother might be the very reason Camilla misses out on what she wants most. Anne's relationship with the Queen Mother and why it could hinder Camilla's desire. So, you see, long before Princess Anne became known as the hardest-working royal in the family, she was just one of the Queen Mother's grandchildren, and by most accounts, one who spent a lot of time by her side. That bond rarely made headlines, but it seems to have shaped more of Anne's outlook than most people realize. Princess Anne was born in 1950, the second child of the then Princess Elizabeth and Prince Philip. Her early childhood lined up almost exactly with the years her grandmother, the Queen Mother, was going through a painful new chapter of her own life. King George VI died in February 1952, when Anne was barely 2 years old, and the woman who had been queen consort suddenly became a widow at 51. Royal historians have often said that in the years after her husband's death, the Queen Mother leaned heavily on family, especially her grandchildren, for comfort and company. Anne, along with her older brother Charles, grew up spending a lot of time with their grandmother, both at Royal Lodge in Windsor, and, most of all, during long stretches of the Scottish summer at Birk Hall. That detail matters more than it seems at first. Much of the public story around Birk Hall has focused on Charles, since he was the one who ended up inheriting the house. But Anne was just as present there during those early years. Family friends and biographers have often described the two grandchildren as unusually close to their grandmother, each in their own way. Charles was often called the Queen Mother's favorite, a claim repeated so many times it has almost become an accepted fact. But some royal commentators have pushed back on the idea that Anne's bond with the Queen Mother mattered any less, just that it was talked about less. Anne, by nature far more private and far less willing to discuss her personal life, rarely gave interviews touching on her grandmother at all. What has come out over the years has mostly come through others, palace staff, biographers, and the odd offhand comment from family members at public events. As Anne grew older, that early closeness reportedly settled into something steadier, less about childhood comfort and more about shared habits and shared values. While Charles's bond with his grandmother is often described in warm, sentimental terms, gardens, letters, long talks by the fire, Anne's connection is usually described differently, built less on words and more on doing things together. The Queen Mother was known for showing affection through activity rather than conversation, taking grandchildren out riding, walking the grounds at Birk Hall, or simply sitting together at the races. Of all her grandchildren, Anne is the one most often mentioned as having matched that style naturally, rather than having to learn it. One detail that keeps coming up involves the Queen Mother's love of horses and country life, an interest Anne shared far more directly than Charles ever did. The Queen Mother was a lifelong supporter of national hunt horse racing, regularly attending meets well into her 90s, and Anne, who went on to compete as an Olympic equestrian in 1976, has often been described as the grandchild who most closely matched that particular passion. Royal watchers have long pointed out that the two shared a practical, outdoors way of thinking that set them apart from the rest of the family. A connection that reportedly went deeper than the usual grandmother-grandchild relationship, where other family members were drawn to formal royal life. Anne and her grandmother were said to be most at ease outdoors, away from cameras, doing something rather than simply being seen. That closeness is exactly why some sources now believe Anne's name has entered the conversation about Birk Hall and the Greville tiara. According to those familiar with the family's private matters, discussions about the long-term future of both the house and the tiara have reportedly not been treated as a simple, one-sided decision left entirely to Charles and Camilla. Instead, sources say Anne, as the surviving grandchild whose bond with the Queen Mother is now seen by some within the family as just as strong as her brother's, has quietly shared her own view on where these particular pieces of the Queen Mother's legacy should end up. That difference is small, but reportedly important. As king, Charles still holds full legal authority to do as he wishes with both the house and the tiara. Nothing about Anne's involvement changes that basic legal fact. What has apparently shifted, according to these reports, is the emotional and family backdrop to the decision. This is where it gets really interesting. Several sources close to the family have suggested that Anne has never been fully comfortable with the idea of items so closely tied to the Queen Mother's personal history being permanently and irreversibly settled outside the direct bloodline built around their grandmother, rather than through marriage. If true, that would fit the reputation Anne has built over more than 5 decades of public life. Someone who rarely speaks publicly about family matters, but who is known within royal circles for holding firm, private views on tradition, continuity, and what she sees as proper care of the family's history. It's worth remembering that Anne has never been shy about sharing her opinions in private, even while staying famously quiet in public. Royal biographers have often described her as blunt, sometimes to the point that it unsettles other family members, especially when she feels a decision affects the long-term integrity of family tradition rather than just personal taste. That bluntness has become something of a trademark over the decades, a willingness to say plainly what others in the family only hint at. If Anne genuinely believes that Burkhall and the Greville tiara carry a weight tied specifically to her grandmother's memory, one that shouldn't simply follow the usual path of passing to a spouse through marriage, that would help explain why her voice has reportedly entered a conversation many assumed had already been quietly settled. None of this means Camilla is being deliberately shut out of spite. Reports have been careful to note that Anne's reported position isn't framed as a personal objection to Camilla herself. Instead, it's described as concern over precedent, over what it could mean for other privately inherited royal items and properties if they're allowed to pass permanently outside the bloodline every time a spouse becomes closely tied to them. That fits the version of Anne most royal watchers recognize. Someone whose loyalty has always seemed to run toward the fork, institution and its long-term future, rather than toward any one person, even within her own family. It also explains why, according to these reports, nobody within the family has painted this as a dispute or a feud. It is described instead as a quiet difference of opinion, the kind that rarely makes it into public view, but can still shape decisions made behind closed doors. What none of this explains yet is how something so personal, a house and a tiara, ends up in the hands of lawyers at all. That's where the real distinction kicks in, the one most people get wrong about royal property. And it's about to change how you see everything we have discussed so far. What really decides who gets Burkhall and the tiara? So here's the detail that trips up most people the moment they start talking about royal inheritance. There's a real difference between property that belongs to the monarch personally and property that belongs to the crown as an institution. You would need to see this, because once you understand that difference, the entire Burkhall and Greville tiara situation starts to look very different. Most people picture the royal family as owners of everything they're photographed near: palaces, castles, jewels, land. In reality, only some of that actually belongs to whoever sits on the throne. Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, for example, aren't personal property at all. They belong to the crown itself, an institution that continues no matter who becomes king or queen. A monarch can't sell them. They cannot leave them to a favorite child, and can't give them to anyone. When one monarch dies, the next one simply takes over, because the buildings were never theirs to give away in the first place. The same is true of the crown jewels and the royal collection. Pieces of art, ceremonial objects, and ancient regalia used at coronations. All of it is held in trust for the nation, not owned outright by any single person. But that's only half the picture. There's a separate category, property that belongs to the monarch personally. The same way any private citizen owns a home or a piece of jewelry. Balmoral and Sandringham fall into this group. Both were bought privately by earlier monarchs, using their own money, and both have been passed down through wills and personal inheritance ever since, not through any government process. When Queen Elizabeth II died in 2022, Balmoral and Sandringham passed to King Charles, simply because she left them to him. The same as any parent leaving property to a child. Thornton Pergol works the same way. And this is where it starts to connect directly back to Camilla. As we covered earlier, the Queen Mother owned it privately. And when she died in 2002, she was free to leave it to whoever she chose. She chose Charles. Nobody in government had any say in that decision, because it was never crown property to begin with. The Greville tiara follows an almost identical path. It was never part of the crown jewels. It came from a private bequest, jewelry left to the Queen Mother personally by Dame Margaret Greville in 1942. When the Queen Mother died, It passed to her daughter, Queen Elizabeth II, the same way a piece of family jewelry might pass from a mother to her daughter in any household. The late Queen then chose to lend it to Camilla, rather than give it away outright. Now stay with this next part, because it's the whole reason this story exists. That word, lend, is where everything turns. A gift and a loan are not the same thing under the law, even if they look identical to everyone watching from the outside. If Camilla had been formally given the tiara, it would belong to her outright, the same as any object handed over as a permanent gift. She could keep it for life and eventually leave it to whoever she chose. But a loan is different. A loan means the item still legally belongs to whoever is lending it, and that person, or their heirs, can decide what happens to it next. When the late Queen passed away in 2022, control of the tiara didn't automatically transfer to Camilla just because she had been wearing it for over a decade. Instead, it reportedly passed into the wider pool of King Charles's private inheritance, the same collection of personal property that includes Burkhall. That single legal detail explains why lawyers are involved at all. This was never treated as a public or constitutional matter because none of it touches Crown property. It's a private inheritance question, the kind any family lawyer might handle for an ordinary client. Except this particular client happens to be the king, and the property happens to include a house linked to Balmoral and a tiara linked to state banquets. Because Charles has full legal freedom over both, he could, in theory, formally gift both the house and the tiara to Camilla at any point, settling the matter once and for all. Reports suggest that hasn't happened, and according to sources close to the family, Anne's involvement may be part of the reason why. But it doesn't stop there either. If Anne has genuinely raised concerns about certain items passing permanently outside the bloodline built around the Queen Mother, that view carries weight precisely because Charles's decision is entirely discretionary. Nothing about the law forces his hand either way. He could give the tiara to Camilla tomorrow, or he could just as easily decide it stays within a more direct line of inheritance, closer to blood relatives of the Queen Mother, rather than a spouse who joined the family later. That flexibility, normally invisible to the public, is exactly what turns a quiet family conversation into something lawyers need to formally document, because whatever gets decided will need to hold up cleanly for the next generation. And that brings us to where things actually stand right now. For Camilla, that leaves real uncertainty hanging over two things she has spent almost 2 decades quietly building a life around: a house she has treated as a private sanctuary, and a tiara that has become so associated with her that most people assume she already owns it outright. Neither assumption may be safe, and for Anne, whose bond with the Queen Mother was rarely discussed in public but apparently ran just as deep as her brother's, this may be less about property at all, and more about making sure her grandmother's legacy ends up exactly where she believes it belongs. So, do you think Princess Anne is right to raise concerns about Burkhall and the Greville tiara staying within the bloodline? Or should Camilla have been given both outright after all these years? Let us know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more. And if you want to see what happens next, check out the video on your screen right now.